Constraints on formation of world-class gold deposits via integration of geological history, geometry and kinematics. Brett hardly needs an introduction, I guess, to this audience, but just in case, Brett is widely regarded in the exploration and mining industry for his application of applied structural geology to numerous commodity types and mineral deposit styles. The approach Brett has brought to understanding mineralizing environments globally is a product of the integration of modern structural geology and techniques married with several decades of applied research. Brett has held various technical and senior managerial roles at consultancy groups and in mining and exploration companies prior to running his own international geology consultancy, Alinda Gold Pty Limited. Brett currently holds an adjunct senior research fellow position at JCU, James Cook. Thanks, Brett.
Thanks, Nick. I'll use the microphone when I can, but like every other speaker today, it's a bit hard to see the screen sometimes. And the first thing I will mention is that I had this abstract submitted and accepted before the Olympics. So this was actually the first international breakdancing contribution for the year. So I want that acknowledged. And I also thought, well, everybody's got to give themselves a name, so I'm going to be called K-Matic for this one, all right? And on a more serious note, I just figured that my contribution can't be as bad as ray guns, so I've got that in my favour. So I'll just start with a few spoilers, and the best thing about today is there's a whole heap of speakers, including Andrew just now, and Stan, who've set the scene remarkably for me, because what I want to talk about is how the change in far-field stress orientation can affect the kinematics of individual fault systems and the mineralisation that is hosted on those. And this harks back to some of the stuff that Rich has said with his big-scale controls on deposits. Looking at the terrain scale, you change the fundamental fault geodynamics as you change your far-field stress vectors. And what will happen is if we go from, say, a dip-slip environment through to a strike-slip one, commonly this is when we facilitate and sponsor the ingress of our fluids and of our intrusion. So some of the things that I'll talk about today will be orogenic and intrusion-related gold systems. I'm not going to go so much into intrusion-related gold systems and their genetic aspects, rather than just looking at when the mineralisation comes into these things. Because that's a can of worms, and we all know after Rich's talk they're all orogenic anyway. They all need to develop a permeability network to get those intrusions in there and those fluids in there, so I want to talk about that as well. The common scenario, and this is not always, is the fluids responsible for gold ingress are quite late in the formation of these hydrothermal permeability systems. And the things I'll go through today, this isn't an all-encompassing model. What I'm going to show you is a number of relationships that occur so commonly that I think there's something that we have to appreciate and see, because more often than not, we're seeing these changes in kinematics, the changes in movement sense that are sponsoring the ingress of the fluids. And I don't think we take enough care in industry, apart from, a few of the talks I've seen today, to actually acknowledge the kinematic history of our deposits. And it can be really critical to how we understand the evolution of these hydrothermal systems. So commonly there's a bit of a tectonic break or a tectonic hiatus between the events which start your hydrothermal system and when the gold comes in. It's not always the case. Sometimes we'll have a change in the far-field stress orientation which will happen progressively within one event, but sometimes it will happen in a successive event as well. And that change can be marked. It can be something like 90 degrees. You might go from sub-horizontal shortening through to sub-vertical shortening, or it might be relatively minor. It might be 10 to 15 degrees, but it's enough to sponsor a change in the kinematics that are accommodated by the host structures. So what I want to talk about is just some of the fundamental things that I don't think we do often enough now when we're documenting our gold deposits. We're not putting together our geological histories, our snapshots of the overprinting, sequence of events that form these deposits, and we're not marrying that with geometry, and in turn we're not marrying that with kinematics. And what I want to do is show why that's important by going through half a dozen deposits. I'm not as ambitious as Jun, I can't go through 20. I'll show you half a dozen examples. And what I want to do is build on previous workers and the great contributions they've made, but also the mistakes as well. So these are the ones I'm going to go through. We're going to start over here in Idaho with Beartack, go across over into Newfoundland and look at two things there, one with Omega Metals and one with Mariner Resources. We'll go down into Guyana, which is really turning into a powerhouse for orogenic gold deposits now. We'll then head across to Sukari, which is a truly giant deposit, which is intrusion hosted, and then we'll duck down over here to have a look at Havieron and then to Kanowna Belle. And it might seem ambitious, but really what I'm going to do is just give very quick snapshots of these things. And if you want to throw vegetables for a protracted session, we can do it afterwards when we have beers. So let's start with Beartack. And it's really interesting. It's on a major crustal structure called the Panther Creek Fault Zone. And this thing, it starts off life being relatively ductile, so up in here. And then as we go across, it becomes progressively more brittle. What we see is the accommodation of movement on it initially, the setup of the initial permeability is west side up and dextral. And what I'll do with all of these diagrams is I'll start over here on the left and I'll cascade stuff down across to the right so that we go from oldest to youngest events. And this is a summary of the events in that deposit. It's not exhaustive, but it's what it's done to give us an overprinting history that establishes where the mineralisation sits within that evolving hydrothermal network. So we start here with this west side up dextral movement, and dextral's always green. Remember that next time you're putting your maps together. Sinistral is always red. And so what we see is we start the system here in the ductile with this movement, which is dextral, and as we progress with time, we accommodate sinistral movement, and when we have that flip, and you can see the change in the movement vector on the structure with those dots there, that's when the mineralisation comes in. We've had this kinematic flip. If we go to the Oko Main and Ghanie deposits, and these are ones that are owned by G2 Goldfields, this is a massive multi-million ounce deposit. It's hosted by laminated quartz veins. It's a true orogenic gold deposit. Locally extremely high grade, and I've had the privilege of having 3 visits there so far to have a look at this thing. I think we've just about nailed it. What you see is you have these quartz reefs coming in here, which is out here, and the other thing to tell you is quartz on my diagrams is always orange, so you'll know what you're looking at. And when that is coming in, that major structure, the Oko Main and Ghanie deposits on the Ghanie shear zone, they're forming during east side down dextral movement. Then we have this kinematic flip when we go from one event to another. We may have a small tectonic hiatus, but then we go into east side up sinistral movement, and here's the gold out here. These reefs are actually precursor structures. They're purely a rheological host. They're being developed, but without any of the gold. We're overprinting the gold on them later, and it explains why in many places in the district, you can have quartz veins, but you don't have gold. You need that subsequent event to reactivate these things, commonly with a different movement sense, and to overprint it and create new permeability due to that rheology contrast. So if we go across now to Newfoundland, Newfoundland is another one of these places which is, it's almost standing room only with the amount of exploration companies that are in there. I've had the privilege of working there down on the Cape Ray shear zone and up here with Maritime Resources. The overall tectonics of this is we've got a piece of Laurentia and then we've just slammed successively a number of terrains of Gondwana into it. So what we end up with is a number of terrains which are juxtaposed across these major structures as we've slammed material in. And the Cape Ray Fault Zone is one of those major structures. And up here we have Maritime Resources with the Havieron deposit up in this part of the world as well. So we'll have a look at Havieron first. And this was a really interesting one. There'd been a fair bit of previous work, and what they said was that the quartz veins there were the same age as the gold, and it was developed in an extensional vein setting. And when I had a look at it, it didn't quite make sense. And I'm an absolute Gumby with leapfrog, okay? So I had somebody help me model this, so I'll give other people credit for it. But what you could see is in the old workings and in the core, you could see vein geometries here, which I've summarised up there, which were extension vein geometries, which the guys had brought them out in the modelling, but they hadn't recognised them. And you can see that they have been developed under a dextral sense of shear. But there's a sigmoidal shape to those veins. And as you go out of that sigmoid, these veins get progressively more attenuated. You start to lose that geometry, but you can still just see it. And what's happened is you've actually changed the movement sense on the host structure, and you've attenuated this and turned this into a contractional jog. That's happened under a clockwise rotation of the principal stress of about 10 to 15 degrees, not very much at all, but this is when the gold is coming in, during this clockwise rotation as we go around to the sinistral movement. Remember, red is sinistral. So in the history, when we look at this, what we see is we've got dextral shear on the structure, and then we have this flip in kinematics, and that's when the gold comes in. Now, these geological histories that I compile to, I commonly put the history in with the sulphide budget next to it. I'm not doing a detailed paragenesis of all the sulphide species and mineralisation. It's as Rich says, I mean, you'll have one aliquid of fluid, then you'll have a bit of gold, another aliquid of fluid, and you'll have a bit of gold, and another growth zone on a pyrite. This is the mineralised package I'm talking about. It's the mineralising episode. So on the Cape Ray Shear Zone, remember that's one of these great big terrain bounding faults that comes through here. What we've got with that is we've got oriented core from a number of deposits along this thing. We have got historical workings where you've got exposure of some of these orogenic quartz veins. We've got one of the best aeromagnetic data sets I've seen in the world, which is this grade underlay underneath here. And when you look at all of those things, what you can tease out based on the overprinting of the different kinematic indicators is you start off life with a dextral sense of shear on the Cape Ray Shear Zone. Then it actually flips over to sinistral because you've just had a very slight change in the far field stress, and that's when the gold comes in. And we've got constraints on the age of that because through here we're also having the ingress of a number of felsic intrusions. And we have got Claudia Gojillo in the audience here today from B2 Gold, and she'll back me up on this because she's been in the field with me. So I just thought I'd throw somebody else under the bus. So this is one which might be a little bit controversial because there's always somebody in the audience, and I don't know if John Standing's here, but because he's usually pretty vocal, but that have worked on Sukari. Sukari is one of the world's true giant deposits. It's a granodiorite hosted deposit. It's massive. I forget what the gold budget is. Let's say 10 million ounces for argument. We can go plus or minus 1 or 2, but it's massive. And historically, when people have looked at this, because it has a number of very steep faults in it, what people have said, well, it's been a thrust environment and you've progressively tectonically sliced this thing up. You've had reverse movements on all of these structures, and in doing that, you've also boudinaged it, you've introduced your quartz veins, and at the same time, you've brought your mineralisation in. If you're as lucky as what I was, and you get to spend a month there with the guys in the core shed, and you go through kilometre after kilometre of core, and you work out all of the overprinting relationships, if you then get a lot of trips underground, and then you spend a lot of time in the shitty Egyptian sun stamping around in the open pit, then you walk around all of the concessions, what you can tease out is a fairly complex history, which when you put it together, you find that you've actually got two hydrothermal systems that overlap. And the first one is during D1 horizontal shortening. This is when all of the quartz reefs come in. The gold is right out here at the end. It's an overprinting sequence of fluid flow and permeability events. And it's only by putting all of this together and putting the sequence together, then tying it back to the kinematics and tying it back to the structures and looking at it from every scale from the core to the deposit that you can actually work that out. So this is what I think, this is Brett's view of the world of how Sukari forms. And I've just had a paper accepted, so it's fine, okay? So I think you start off with a granodiorite like this, and you start to progressively slice it with these reverse faults. So it's hanging wall up on all of these things. And that's what people have seen historically, and they've always said, okay, that's how this thing is formed. This is when the quartz reefs have come in. This is when we've got the mineralisation. This is when we've got this deposit scale boudinage happening. However, what you've got ghosted in the background of this is a very, very, very detailed geological section. The guys have spent weeks, months, whatever, under the tutelage of Craig Barker, one of the best technical geos in the industry, and they have compiled a whole suite of very detailed geological sections that show that these individual segments and these boudinage geometries of this deposit have actually then been refolded. So all of these structures which originally had reverse movements on them have actually then gone into extension, and they've all gone hanging wall side down. And that's when the gold comes in, based on that geological history that I showed you before. And it explains why some parts of these big reefs just don't have gold in them. It's there earlier. They're just a competency contrast that you overprint. Kanowna Belle. Now, I know there's probably a few Northern Star people here. My background with Kanowna Belle is when I first came to Western Australia, this was my project. And I spent 7 months underground. I mapped all of the initial stopes in that deposit. I collected hundreds of oriented samples. I cut spatially oriented thin sections. I etched them. I did mountains and mountains of metres of mapping. And at the end of the day, what I said was there's 2 stages of gold. There's an early telluride associated stage and there's a later sulphide associated stage. More recently, Sugiono has done work there, and he's pretty well confirmed that and added in an extra stage of gold. But what he's done is also confirm what I thought at the time was we had north-south contraction with reverse faults. The main gold budget is coming in when we change over from that contraction to strike slip. And we're actually changing that direction of contraction from north-south very slightly to east-northeast, west-southwest. And the final one I'll show is Havieron. So I worked on Havieron a few years ago, and if you guys have ever gone to the literature and tried to find information on the controls to Havieron, probably what you would be excused for thinking is it's an intrusion-related, pretty passive porphyry-style deposit. All you need is an igneous intrusion, and that there's no role played whatsoever by structure. You could not be more wrong. This whole system is structurally controlled. It's an intrusion-related deposit, yes, but it's deformation controlled. And what you have is you have a major structure coming up which initially accommodated a reverse movement on it, a hanging wall upside movement. When that movement then went into strike slip, as we've had a change in the orientation of the far field stress, this is what has sponsored the ingress of the intrusions, which people have implicated as being associated with mineralisation. This is when all of the gold, all of the deposit formation that is critical for the metal budget has occurred. So it's really interesting to see that there's actually a very, very complex structural architecture to this deposit, which really hasn't made it out into the literature before now. I'll give full credit to Newmont. As soon as they took over the deposit, I asked for permission to present this and they said yes. So I just wanted to get the deformation story out there. There are myelinite zones in here, 10 plus metres wide, which nobody knows about. Okay, there's a lot of deformation, and it is absolutely, totally critical to getting this mineralisation in. And if there's anybody working in the Patterson, and you guys have not gone to the PhD thesis by Simon Hewson on Telfer, then you're actually working a little bit blind, because there's an incredible amount of structural information there on the emplacement of intrusions and on the emplacement of gold. So, concluding comments after that little romp through half a dozen across the world, we've got an enduring problem. The contributor events and structural controls, they're commonly not identified in exploration mining data and so forth. And part of the reason behind that is we are not faithfully documenting the geological histories of these deposits, and we're not putting the geometries of the host structures into there, and we're not attributing the kinematics to those structures and seeing where the gold fits within that history. I guarantee you that I could get all the people here and ask how many of you have actually put a snapshot of your deposit together in terms of a geological history, and you can tell me what the kinematics on your structures are. There's probably 1 or 2% of the people here could do that with their deposits. It just isn't done, and yet it should be, because it shows what the age and controls on your mineralisation are. And yes, some of these geological histories will be wrong, and we will have diachronous events, and we will have some that flip backwards and forwards in that. But if you don't make an attempt to find out where that mineralisation sits in that overall history and what the kinematics of those structures are, whether you're in restraining bends or extensional bends, these kinematic flips are being important because what we're doing is we're changing these structures from contractional to extensional, and we're allowing the ingress of those extra fluids and intrusions. Up until that point, we're actually in a fairly tight environment. So, some of those things that I just said, it's because earlier structures are also reused. So we end up with these composite structures, and sometimes we mask that earlier history. You've got to be diligent. You've got to try and tease that out. The magnitudes of later displacements are commonly not great, and if you go into some of these deposit scale structures, what we'll see is we'll see our geophysical data sets like our seismic, and the first order architecture, maybe it's a thrust duplex or whatever, when we overprint it in subsequent events, which may reactivate these with different kinematics, those next events might be very weak. So at the scale of our data set, we actually don't see much in the way of those overprinting structures. We don't see the fact that we've turned it into an extensional fault versus a contractional fault because the amount of movement on it might be relatively minor. But it's minor at the scale of your data set. It might be really fundamental at the scale of emplacing a deposit. And the other one, which drives me absolutely bananas, is this one. It's the culture of not removing core from the tray for logging. We've got this thing now where people get the fieldies to line up all the core and they put the orientation mark on for you and you put it in the core tray and then you log it. So you don't pull it out and then you get your IQ logger and you go along, and if you've got Parkinson's, you've got a problem because you're going to hit 200 measurements in 2 seconds. And that's it. You don't actually pull it out, turn it around, look at the kinematics, you know. So that becomes a bit of a problem. And one of the really comforting things I saw recently with G2 Gold is when they get the core and lay it out to orientate it, that's when the geologists log it. When it's sitting on that skinny V-bar, they see all of the core and they pick it up and they log it while it's out of the tray. So that's one of my bugbears. In many cases, what we see is the quartz reefs predate mineralisation, and this was mentioned this morning by David Groves and by Rich. You know, sometimes these things are just early and don't have mineralisation. You get an overprint because they're a competent body. There's one here, and really this comes down to training and just, you know, have a go. A lot of geologists in general, they're either not confident or proficient in the interpretation of kinematic indicators. And the only way you're going to do that is if you keep trying and if you ask advice, and I still get it wrong, but maybe not as much as other people because I spend a lot of time doing it. But that's one of the things that we should be trying to do. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to apply kinematics and geological history to enhance the workability and predictive capacity of our geology models. Because this is fundamental and it's typically unrecognised, and it should be part of this mineral system analysis process, whatever that is. You know, we all hear about this, this oft-opined mineral system analysis, and I just think, you know, if you're doing good geology and you're doing the overprinting and you're trying to work out what your permeability network is and what's trapping stuff at the end, you don't have to give it a fancy name, you're doing good geology. So I just think, in a concluding comment, is this failure to identify the kinematic regime and the structural age of deformation events, particularly orogenic gold deposits. I think we've probably missed quite a few deposits because we actually haven't understood our deformation architecture. And I will leave it there, guys, and just say the next talk is going to be fantastic. It's by Sarah Jones, and she told me not to say that. And throw your rotten vegetables.
Thank you, Brett. That was much, much better than
I
Ray-Ban.
can see you chomping at the bit, Nick.
Sorry. I did like the two-stage bit, but I thought a little bit you might have cherry-picked those deposits. So the question is, particularly for Kanowna Belle, you can see that little sniff of the early history, and then you want to bring in most of the gold late. My question for the other ones, and I don't like the idea of just using old quartz veins as rheological boundaries to bring in random gold. I don't think that kind of works. But the real question is, how do you distinguish between a second generation that has picked up all of the first generation gold and put it into the second generation structures versus totally independent gold that's only using those second generation structures?
Yeah, okay, so Kanowna Belle's an interesting one, Nick, so I probably didn't explain it well enough. The first stage of mineralisation is mineralogically characteristic. It's telluride associated. It's associated with a particular vein set which is cross-cut and overprinted by the ones that have got the Arsenian pyrite, which is oscillatory zoned and refractory. So you can tell the two stages apart. Volumetrically, one might be 0.0001% of the budget and the rest is the Arsenian refractory component. I don't know how you tell when you recycle one into the other. I mean, I don't do isotopes. I don't have your intellectual cutlery, so I don't do that sort of stuff. All I'm doing is giving you overprinting relationships that I see, and I guess the caveat I said to cover my arse a bit right at the start was this doesn't apply everywhere all the time. What I'm doing is seeing a number of relationships that are common enough that we need to appreciate them. And the backdrop to that is, to do that, we need to do better in terms of compiling histories of our deposits in kinematics. But I take your points, and I am one of these ones that I belong to Alan Neeshaw's school, which is if you've got a model, you shouldn't be trying to prove it, you should be trying to break it. And that's one of his tenets, which I totally agree with. Big rap, mate.
I don't think it's Alan's model. I think it's called the scientific method.
Yeah, well, you know. I was hoping he's going to buy me a beer, all right?
Any other questions?
Yep, up here. Hi. I was wondering if you could comment or elaborate a bit more on what the mechanism is in this system. So you say we've got like overprinting shear sensors or overprinting like kinematics. So just say sinistral shearing overprinted by dextral shearing. And you referred to that perhaps you form quartz veins in the first event and then they act as competent bodies in the second event. Or perhaps, you know, you also said that your things are too locked up in the first event and then there's this overprinting event that changes things to perhaps create permeability. I was just wondering if you could talk a bit more about what the mechanism actually is that means that you're forming the ore deposit during the second event and opening up that porosity or the permeability.
Yeah, so, sorry, excuse me. So one of the fundamental things is trying to understand, firstly, why you're having these kinematic changes. And places like Newfoundland, for example, you can just say, well, you're continually slamming stuff into that. So depending on your plate vectors as they're moving in, your far field stresses are going to change. Also with many of these systems, you're emplacing intrusions, and as soon as you're doing that, you're distorting your stress field, you're getting perturbations in that, and locally those stresses will change, and then that will sponsor a reversal, or not a reversal, but at least a change in the movement vector on your structures. When you do that, what you're going to do is go from ones, for example, if you've got a contractional bend where you will be creating permeability because you're stressing those rocks. And we tend to think in 2 dimensions, you know, it's a contractional jog, but you're also extending in the 3rd dimension. But it's still relatively tight. If you can change the kinematics on that, you can then open it up and you can go, say, from a contractional jog to an extensional one. You've then got permeability forming, which is opening up on the same host structure, which may have originally had a little bit of fluid coming through, but now you've opened it all up. It's all about permeability creation.
Any other questions? Yeah, Tim?
What about permeability creation?
No, I'm sure it happens.
Most of the speakers today have spoken about structural permeability creation.
Dave's really good stuff about that on the workshop. I mean,
I happen to be sitting next to Keith.
there you go. Like you can have alteration hardening where you may alter something, and for example, you might get an elbite or a silica alteration zone, which then becomes competent that as you restrain those rocks, it will preferentially fracture. You may actually stick a lot of phyllosilicates in there, and as David Grove said earlier this morning, those things, they're a lot easier to pervasively fracture because you're going to accommodate ductile deformation and through-going ductile recrystallisation rather than getting a pervasive vein network through them. So alteration is exceptionally important, which is why it's one of those things I try to incorporate within my histories, but I'm not as good as Nick or a lot of the other people in the room at recognising a lot of these alteration assemblages. So sometimes my logs just go, this is fucking hard, Albite question mark, so.
I'm just thinking through some of the porphyry and ICG systems where phyllosilical alteration comes from removing things like feldspars, and it creates porosity that sucks in more fluid, that creates more phyllosilical alteration, that creates more space. And therefore, I just didn't want us to go too far down the line that the only way to create space is through stress switches.
No, not at all. And I mean, that's not what I was invoking. I was just giving examples of what I am familiar with. I don't step outside of my comfort zone too much.
You're good.
Okay, thank you, Brett.
No worries.